it to Select Committee and see what comes of it.
Holly Walker.
Mr Speaker, I'm pleased to take a call on behalf of the Green Party on this Building Amendment Bill number 4. I spoke before the recess, Mr Speaker, in the committee stages of the Building Amendment Bill number 3, which preceded this bill and which has subsequently passed its third reading in this House. And that bill, as we've heard, and this one, form part of the government's response to the Building Act review completed in 2009. Now, although the Green Party supported the previous bill at its first reading, we were concerned when we heard the submissions at the Select Committee stage at the piecemeal approach that the government had taken, and we've just heard from Mr Twyford that the government is taking a very incremental and tinkering approach to the Building Act review, and those submissions on the previous bill highlighted the shortcomings of that approach. And so, especially because the previous bill lacked reference to consumer protections, the Green Party found ourselves unable to support the previous bill at its final stage. I'm therefore pleased to see that this bill, Building Amendment Bill number 4, does address the very important issue of consumer protection in the building industry, and the Green Party is therefore pleased to support the bill at its first reading tonight. Now, before I talk a little bit more about the provisions in this bill, I want to provide some of the really important context in terms of why we must ensure that the regulatory environment gets it right for building and housing in New Zealand. We have a housing crisis in New Zealand, and it's a crisis both of affordability, housing affordability, and a crisis of housing availability. And nowhere is that more apparent, Mr Speaker, than in Christchurch, where demand for rental housing is out of control. We've seen people needing short-term rentals while they wait for their own homes to be repaired. We've seen people needing long-term rentals if they've had to relocate out of a damaged rental property. We've seen homeowners selling investment properties or moving back into their rental properties and displacing tenants, and we've seen an influx of tradespeople putting extra demands on the rental market in Christchurch, and many state, council and community houses damaged and unavailable at the present time. And in that context, Mr Speaker, we need to be thinking about what are the building regulations, what's the regulatory environment going to be as we repair and rebuild Christchurch. Now, so far the government has been satisfied in Christchurch to more or less let the market find the solution, but the market won't favour those in the lowest incomes, those in the most need, beneficiaries, sole parents, people with disabilities. There's a real crisis brewing. There's been some movement, we think, but not enough. So, as well as short-term intervention in Christchurch to deal with the housing crisis that we're seeing there and temporary assistance from the government, we also need longer-term a better regulatory environment for building and construction. Because there's been a similar crisis brewing in Auckland, and we heard from the previous speaker about market failure in the building industry in Auckland. And the result is that people are finding both extremely difficult to find a home and extremely difficult to afford to either rent or own their own homes. So this bill is important, Mr Speaker, because it sets the regulatory context in which the construction and the rebuild of Christchurch will take place. And it puts in place, as we've heard, very important consumer protections which the Green Party supports. So we've heard already in the debate so far, the bill will introduce mandatory written consents for work valued over a prescribed amount. It will introduce mandatory disclosure of certain information by building contractors. It creates new offences for breaches of these requirements. It adds new powers for territorial authorities to deal with buildings that are at risk because they're near or adjacent to dangerous buildings. It increases the maximum penalty for doing building work without a building consent. It clarifies the powers of the Chief Executive of the Department of Building and Housing to review the performance of territorial authorities, regional authorities and building consent authorities, and as we've heard in a rather unrelated clause, makes some amendments to the dam safety scheme, including giving regional authorities the power to investigate and refer dams for classification. Now, we think that the consumer protections in this bill, particularly around mandatory written contracts for building work over a prescribed amount and mandatory disclosure of certain information by building contractors, are very important. And the reason that they're important is because of the vacuum of regulation in the building industry that we have had previously, and that was born out of the deregulation of the industry by subsequent Labor and national governments in the 1980s and 90s. As we've heard, it was this vacuum of regulation, this period of deregulation, that allowed for the leaky homes crisis to occur, and we've seen the very terrible consequences for homeowners when poor regulation and poor building and construction standards allowed that to take place. So we think in that context that these consumer protections absolutely need to be reinstated, because what we saw with the leaky homes crisis is that many homeowners were left with very inadequate protections, and when everything went pear-shaped and when their homes were found to be substandard, they didn't have adequate protections, and we've had to legislate to make up for that fact. So in that context, it is really important that we get it right for consumers who have taken the plunge to construct or build their own homes when things go wrong, and we support the protections in this bill. However, the Green Party wishes to emphasise that better warranties and better consumer protections, while they're important, are only the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. So therefore, when things go bad, God forbid that a homeowner finds that something drastically has gone wrong with their property and it's no longer habitable. And these protections are great for that scenario, but we need also to be thinking about how to regulate to ensure that buildings are constructed to a higher standard before things go wrong and before we need that ambulance at the bottom of the cliff of greater consumer protections. And we've not been convinced by the government's approach to the Building Act review in the form of the previous Building Amendment Bill and in this one, that the government's approach to the reforms are going to achieve an improved regulatory environment that means it's less likely for buildings to be constructed to poor standards to begin with. So we're looking forward to the contributions in the Select Committee on this bill, but I think we'd echo the concerns of the previous speaker that taking such an incremental and a tinkering approach to what really is required when what really is required is a more fundamental review of the building regulation environment in this country, means we're unlikely to make the really fundamental changes needed to ensure that we don't have to rely on these consumer protections, although it's important that they're in place when things go wrong. I do want to thank and acknowledge the Minister, Maurice Williamson, for the way he's engaged with parties across this House on this legislation. And I do look forward to hearing the contributions at the Select Committee, particularly hearing from consumers about how the consumer protections will affect them and whether they are adequate to meet the needs of building consumers. So, Mr Speaker, the Green Party is pleased to support this bill at first reading. We look forward to engaging further in the debate.
Jackie Dean.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Building Amendment Bill number 4